My name is Gregory Madsen. I am 44 years old, and in 2018 I worked as a regional medical courier covering a large stretch of eastern Oregon. At the time, I lived in Pendleton and drove a refrigerated box truck 4 days a week. My route included clinics and assisted living homes in smaller towns like John Day, Canyon City, and Burns. The job required early starts. I usually left the warehouse by 5:15 a.m., long before sunrise during the winter months. Most of my driving was along Highway 395, where long sections of road passed through open ranch land and low rolling hills with very little development. I liked the routine. The road was predictable. I knew the curves, the elevation changes, and even the places where deer tended to cross. Between Pilot Rock and Ukiah, there's a stretch of highway that feels especially empty. No gas stations, no houses close to the road, and no steady cell signal. Just fencing, sagebrush, and distant tree lines. I drove that segment twice a week, sometimes more if I picked up extra stops. The first time I noticed him was late November, just after Thanksgiving. It had snowed lightly the night before, not enough to cover the pavement, but enough to frost the ground and make the shoulders look pale under headlights. It was about 6:05 a.m., still dark, and I had my high beams on because there was no oncoming traffic. About 50 yards ahead on the right shoulder, I saw what looked like a man standing near a fence post. He wasn't in the road, just a few feet back from the asphalt. At first, I assumed he was a hunter. That area attracts people during deer season, and sometimes they park farther down a dirt access road and walk in before daylight. As I got closer, I realized I couldn't see any vehicle nearby. No headlights behind him. No truck pulled onto the shoulder ahead. Just open land. The figure stood upright, arms down at his sides, facing the highway. He didn't turn his head as my truck approached. He didn't step back. He didn't signal. I slowed slightly as I passed. My headlights swept across him for a moment. He appeared to be wearing a long dark coat, possibly brown or black. I couldn't make out his face clearly. I checked my side mirror after passing him. He remained still, positioned near the fence, facing the road. I told myself it wasn't my business. People stand outside for all kinds of reasons. Maybe he had parked somewhere I couldn't see. Maybe he was waiting for someone. 2 days later, on Friday morning, he was there again. This time he stood on the opposite side of the highway, maybe a quarter mile north of where I had seen him before. The posture was the same, arms relaxed at his sides. No movement, no vehicle in sight. That second sighting stayed with me longer than I expected. I drove the rest of my route, thinking about how cold it had been that week. Overnight temperatures were in the low 20s. Standing outside without visible activity for any length of time didn't seem comfortable. The following Tuesday, I saw him again. Same general area, back on the right shoulder, slightly farther down from the original position, but within the same 5-mile stretch between mile markers 47 and 52. By the fourth sighting, I started paying closer attention. I checked for tire tracks in the snow along the shoulder. I looked for a parked truck tucked behind a rise. I didn't see anything that explained how he had gotten there. Over the next month, I saw him a total of 8 times, always before sunrise, always alone, always standing still near the fence line, never directly in the roadway. He never tried to wave me down or step forward. One morning in mid-December, I decided to stop. It wasn't an emotional decision. I simply wanted to confirm that what I was seeing was an actual person and not some kind of visual distortion caused by shadows and fence posts. That stretch of highway can play tricks on your eyes in low light, especially when snow reflects headlights at odd angles. I slowed my truck and pulled onto the gravel shoulder about 30 yards ahead of where he stood. I turned on my hazard lights and let the engine idle. For a moment, I stayed in the cab, watching through the windshield. The figure did not move. I stepped out of the truck. The air felt sharp and dry. My boots made a crunching sound in the frost as I walked back along the shoulder. I kept my eyes on the spot where he had been standing. When I reached the area, there was no one there. No person. No sound of footsteps. No movement in the brush. I scanned the open land carefully. The fields were flat for a long distance before rising into low hills. There was nowhere obvious someone could have gone in the few seconds it took me to park and step out. I looked down at the ground. The frost showed only my own boot prints and the faint outline of older tire marks from passing vehicles. I did not see a clear set of fresh footprints leading away from the shoulder. I stood there for about a minute, listening. The only sound was my truck engine idling behind me and a faint hum from the wind across the fencing. The highway was empty in both directions. I walked back to the truck without rushing. I didn't feel panicked. I felt uncertain, like I had missed something simple. 2 mornings later, he was there again. Same posture, same general location. This time I did not stop. I drove past at a steady speed and kept my eyes forward. I checked the mirror, and for a second I thought I saw him slightly turned, but I can't be sure. It may have been the angle of the headlights, shifting as I drove. By January, the sightings continued at least once a week. They were not every day, which made it harder to treat it as a fixed object. If it had been a scarecrow or some ranch marker, it would have been visible consistently in daylight as well. I drove that route occasionally during the afternoon when covering for another driver, and I never saw anything resembling a coat on a post or a figure near the fence during the day. I considered mentioning it to the county sheriff's office, but decided against it. I had no report of crime, no interaction, no threat, just a person standing on public land. The last time I saw him was in early February. It had been unusually cold that week, and there was a layer of snow deeper than before. He stood on the right side again, near a slightly bent fence post I recognized. I remember thinking that if I stopped and walked back, I would finally confirm it one way or the other. I didn't stop. I drove past and completed my deliveries as usual. The following week, he wasn't there, nor the week after. By March, the early mornings began to lighten earlier, and the snow had mostly melted. I found myself glancing toward the fence line automatically, expecting to see him, but the shoulders remained empty. I transferred to a different route later that year for scheduling reasons. I have not driven that particular stretch regularly since then. I don't claim that what I saw was anything unusual beyond explanation. It could have been the same person repeatedly visiting that spot for reasons I never understood. It could have been someone crossing land before dawn. It could have been my eyes misjudging distance and shadow in low light. What stays with me is the consistency. The posture never changed. The silence never broke. He never approached the road, never acknowledged my presence, never appeared connected to a vehicle. For nearly 2 months, on a quiet stretch of Highway 395 between mile marker 47 and 52, there was a man standing alone in freezing temperatures before sunrise. He appeared just often enough to become familiar, but not often enough to feel predictable. Then he stopped appearing. There was no conclusion, no confrontation, no explanation offered. Just an empty roadside again, like it had always been. My name is Leonard Whitaker. I am 53 years old, and for 11 years I managed a small roadside motel just outside Bedford, Pennsylvania, near the Turnpike exit. The property had 22 rooms arranged in 2 rows, exterior entrances facing a rectangular parking lot. It wasn't a franchise. It was privately owned, built in the late 70s, and updated only when something broke. Most of our guests were passing through. Truck drivers, families heading west, contractors working short-term jobs. The work was steady and predictable. I handled check-ins from 3 p.m. until midnight, reconciled the books, and did a final walk of the lot before locking up. In February of 2019, during a stretch of cold weather, a man checked in who I still remember clearly. He arrived a little after 8:30 p.m. It had been snowing lightly all evening, and the parking lot was covered in a thin layer of slush. He drove a gray 4-door sedan, nothing distinctive about it. He came into the office alone, carrying a small black duffel bag. Mid to late 30s, average height, clean-shaven, wearing a dark winter coat. He spoke in a calm, low voice and asked for a room for 2 nights. He paid in cash. That wasn't unusual for us. He filled out the registration card with the name Aaron Mills and listed a Columbus, Ohio address. The handwriting was neat and steady. He declined housekeeping service and took a key for room 214, which was on the second floor at the far end of the building. I watched him on the security monitor as he climbed the stairs and unlocked the door. He went inside and closed it behind him. That was the last time I saw him in person. The first night passed without issue. No noise complaints. No calls to the office. At around 11 p.m., I did my usual lot check. His gray sedan was parked under one of the dim lights near the stairwell. Everything looked normal. The next morning, housekeeping started at 9 a.m. Around 9:30, my head housekeeper, Diane, came into the office and mentioned that room 214 had a do not disturb sign hanging on the knob. That was fairly common. Guests often put it out early, especially if they were sleeping in. That evening, I arrived at 3 p.m. for my shift. The sedan was still in the same spot. Around 7:45 p.m., I happened to glance at the monitor and noticed the car was gone. I assumed he had gone out for dinner or to get gas. There are only a few restaurants nearby, so most guests drive into town. By 9:30 p.m., the car still hadn't returned. I didn't think much of it. People sometimes come back late. Around 11:50 p.m., I did my final parking lot walk. The space where the gray sedan had been parked was empty. I locked the office and went home. The next morning at 8:15 a.m., my assistant manager, Kyle, called me. He sounded confused more than concerned. He asked if I had checked out the guest in 214 overnight. I told him I hadn't. Checkout time was 11 a.m., and no key had been dropped in the slot. Kyle said the gray sedan was back in the lot. I drove over immediately. The car was parked in almost the exact same position as before, near the stairwell light. The lot had a fresh dusting of snow from overnight, but the tire tracks were faint and hard to read. I went upstairs to room 214. The do not disturb sign was hanging on the knob again. I knocked twice. No answer. I waited a few seconds and knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Using the master key, I opened the door. The room looked untouched. The bedspread was smooth and tight, just as housekeeping had made it before his arrival. The bathroom towels were folded. The trash can was empty. There was no sign that anyone had slept there. The small duffel bag he carried in was gone. The only thing out of place was that the television remote was missing from the dresser. I searched the usual spots, under the bed, behind the nightstand. It wasn't there. I checked the closet and bathroom again. Empty. Back downstairs, I reviewed the security footage from the previous evening. At 9:18 p.m., the camera showed the gray sedan pulling out of its parking space and exiting the lot. At 9:21 p.m., the guest came down the stairs carrying his duffel bag. He got into the driver's seat and left. That matched what we saw outside. What we did not see was the car returning. I went through footage from midnight to 6 a.m. The entrance camera clearly showed every vehicle that entered. Snowflakes passed through the frame steadily all night. No gray sedan appeared. Yet, there it was in the lot at 8 a.m. I called the Bedford Borough Police non-emergency line and explained the situation. An officer arrived around 10 a.m. He ran the license plate number. It came back registered to a different name than the one on our registration card. Someone in Eastern Ohio. We tried calling the phone number listed on the guest's paperwork. It went straight to voicemail. The greeting did not identify a name. The officer looked inside the vehicle through the windows. The interior appeared clean. No luggage in the back seat. On the front passenger seat was one of our motel notepads, a single blank page torn off and placed flat on the fabric. I recognized the logo immediately. There was no sign of forced entry into the car. Doors were locked. After waiting several hours with no contact from the guest, the officer arranged to have the vehicle towed. Room 214 was technically still rented through that second night, but the guest never returned. Checkout time came and went. We documented the incident and held on to the paperwork. About a week later, police informed us that the registered owner claimed he had sold the vehicle months earlier. He did not recognize the name Aaron Mills. I was not given further details. What unsettled me more happened afterward. We cleaned and rented room 214 again 2 days later. The next guest stayed one night and, during checkout, casually mentioned hearing someone pacing outside his door around 1 a.m. He assumed it was another guest and didn't complain. A few days later, another guest in 214 reported something similar. Slow footsteps outside the door late at night, back and forth, as if someone were walking the length of the walkway. When he opened the door, no one was there. I checked the security footage for those nights. The camera covering that section of the second floor walkway showed no movement at the reported times. No person walking past. No shadow crossing the frame. After the fourth similar comment in about 6 weeks, I decided to stay in 214 myself on a weeknight when occupancy was low. I brought a book and turned off the television around 12:30 a.m. The building was quiet. At approximately 1:17 a.m., I heard it, footsteps outside the door. They were measured and steady, not rushed. The sound of shoes against the concrete walkway. They moved from left to right, then paused, then moved back. The pattern continued for about 3 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened without speaking. The sound was distinct enough that I was certain it was not wind or plumbing. When the pacing stopped, I stood up immediately and opened the door. The walkway was empty. The parking lot lights cast long, still shadows across the pavement. No cars were moving. No doors were closing. I checked the footage the next morning. The timestamp matched exactly when I heard the pacing. The camera showed an empty walkway. After that, the reports gradually stopped. Room 214 continued to be rented. No more comments about footsteps. I managed a motel until 2022, when the property was sold to a larger company. I never experienced anything else unusual in that room beyond those pacing sounds. I cannot explain how the gray sedan returned to the parking lot without appearing on camera. I cannot explain why the room looked unused despite being rented for 2 nights. And I cannot explain the footsteps that several guests, including myself, heard outside 214 with no visible person present. There was no damage, no threat, no confrontation. Just a guest who checked in quietly, left with his bag, and whose car came back without him. And for a while after, the sound of someone walking slowly past the door that no one was standing outside of. My name is Russell Keene. I am 46 years old, and 5 winters ago, I rented a small cabin near Lake Vermilion in northern Minnesota to spend some time alone after my divorce. At the time, I was working remotely as a project estimator for a construction company based in Minneapolis. I could do my job from anywhere with stable internet, and I needed distance more than anything else. A friend recommended a seasonal cabin outside the town of Tower. It sat on a narrow inlet of the lake, surrounded by tall pine and birch trees. During the summer, the area was active with boat traffic and vacationers, but in January, it was nearly silent. The cabin itself was modest. 1 bedroom, a combined kitchen and living area, a wood stove in the corner, and a small propane heater as backup. The nearest neighboring cabin was about 200 yards away, partially hidden by trees. Most of the surrounding properties were closed up for the winter. The road leading in was plowed once a week unless snowfall was heavy. I arrived in early January and settled into a routine quickly. I woke around 6:30 each morning, made coffee on the stovetop, and checked emails while the sky lightened over the frozen inlet. I worked until mid-afternoon, then stepped outside to split wood or walk along the shoreline before dark. The quiet was steady and uncomplicated. At night, I read or watched downloaded shows and went to bed early. The first unusual thing I noticed was a set of footprints across the inlet. About 3 weeks into my stay, I stepped outside one morning and saw a line of tracks cutting across the snow on the far side of the frozen water. They came from the tree line and led toward the edge of the inlet, stopping about 20 feet from the bank. There was no fishing hole drilled in the ice and no sign of equipment. I assumed someone had walked out to check ice thickness. That was common in the area. Ice fishing was a regular winter activity, and people often scouted locations before setting up shelters. 2 days later, I saw fresh tracks in almost the same location. The snow had fallen lightly overnight, so the prints were clear and recent. Again, they led from the trees to the same spot near the frozen shoreline. And again, they stopped there. This time I decided to walk across and look more closely. The ice was thick enough to support a vehicle by that point in winter, so I felt comfortable crossing on foot. When I reached the far side, I noticed that the prints were deeper near the stopping point, as if the person had stood there for some time, facing my cabin. I turned and looked back toward my place. From that spot, there was a direct line of sight into my living room window. I could see the couch clearly and part of the kitchen area beyond it. If someone stood there during the evening, they would have a clear view whenever my interior lights were on. That realization made me more aware of my surroundings, but not immediately alarmed. The land around the inlet was not privately fenced. It belonged to a mix of state-managed property and seasonal cabin owners. Anyone could walk there legally. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Every few days after fresh snowfall, a new set of tracks would appear, always from the same direction in the woods, always stopping at nearly the same point near the frozen shoreline. I never saw tracks leading directly toward my cabin from that position. They always returned the way they came. I never saw the person making them. One afternoon in early February, I was outside shopping at around 4 p.m. The sky was already beginning to dim. While stacking split logs near the side wall of the cabin, I heard what sounded like compressed snow behind me. A soft crunch, deliberate and slow. I turned immediately. The tree line beyond the clearing was still. No movement between trunks. No figure stepping away. I stood there listening for a full minute. The only sound was a faint shifting of branches and light wind. I told myself it could have been snow settling from a branch or a small animal moving out of sight. That evening around 9 p.m., after I had turned off the television and was reading, I heard a soft thud against the exterior wall facing the inlet. It wasn't loud, more like something lightly striking wood. I assumed it was snow sliding off the roof. 10 minutes later, it happened again. I stepped outside with flashlight. The air was still, temperature hovering near -10. I walked slowly around the cabin perimeter, scanning the snow for disturbance. On the side facing the inlet, near the living room window, I saw a single footprint close to the wall. Just one. It was positioned about 2 feet from the siding, as if someone had stepped close to the cabin and then stepped back into an existing track I could not see clearly in the dim light. The snow elsewhere around the structure appeared undisturbed. I did not find a clear set of prints leading away. It was possible that wind had softened them, but it had not been particularly windy that day. The next morning, I confirmed that there were no visible tracks leading from the cabin back toward the inlet. The single footprint remained near the wall, slightly hardened by overnight cold. As February progressed, temperatures dropped further. Some nights reached -15. The tracks across the inlet continued appearing every few days, though not on a strict schedule. They were frequent enough to feel deliberate. One evening just before sunset, I decided to wait and observe. I turned off the interior lights and sat near the living room window facing the inlet. The sky shifted from pale gray to dark blue. Snow on the frozen water reflected what little light remained. I kept still and watched the tree line across the way. Around 6:20 p.m., I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the trees on the far side of the inlet. The distance made details difficult to see, but the person appeared average height and wore a heavy winter coat. The figure walked slowly to the now familiar stopping point near the frozen edge. Then he stood there, facing my cabin. There was no visible flashlight beam, no ice auger or fishing sled, just a person standing quietly at dusk. I watched for approximately 8 or 10 minutes. The figure did not wave or signal. He did not attempt to cross the ice toward me. He simply remained in place. At one point, I reached over and turned on the interior lights deliberately, wanted to make it clear the cabin was occupied. When I looked back out seconds later, the figure was gone. There was no clear sound of retreating footsteps across the ice. No visible movement back into the trees. The shoreline was empty. The following morning, I crossed the inlet again. Fresh tracks confirmed someone had stood there the previous evening. The prints led back into the woods in a straight line. I followed them about 30 yards before losing them among denser trees and uneven terrain. There was no visible vehicle parked nearby. No smoke from a hidden cabin. Just forest. I contacted the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office and reported that someone had been repeatedly standing across from my rental. A deputy came out later that day. He examined the tracks and told me it was likely someone scouting fishing spots or simply walking the property. He advised me to keep my doors locked and call if anything escalated. Nothing escalated. The tracks continued appearing for another 2 weeks. I stopped crossing the inlet to examine them. Instead, I closed the curtains after dark and kept exterior lights off unless necessary. In early March, as daytime temperatures began rising slightly, the appearances stopped. A snowfall came and went without fresh tracks across the inlet. The tree line remained undisturbed. I finished my rental period at the end of March and returned to Minneapolis. I did not ask the cabin owner whether previous renters had noticed similar activity. I preferred not to turn it into a larger story than it already was. To this day, I cannot say who that person was or why he chose that exact spot repeatedly. He never approached directly while I was outside. He never left a note or attempted contact. He stood at a distance in a place that allowed a clear view of my living room. The experience did not involve threats or confrontation. It was quieter than that. It was repetition, presence without interaction. What stays with me is not fear, but the memory of that still figure at dusk, positioned across a frozen inlet, watching a cabin light up against the snow, then disappearing without explanation, and leaving behind nothing but footprints that led back into the trees.